Reverend Molly Cate is a humanitarian educator passionate about history, science, and bridging the barriers between people holding clashing belief systems. She
I'm
is,
going to have to say goodbye because I can't hear anything.
I wonder if there's a phone number we could give her that she could hear.
I'll reach out to her. Thanks.
Okay. She's the spiritual leader and often soloist for Unity of the Redwoods in Eureka, California, has a master's degree in consciousness studies from Holmes Institute in Santa Rosa, one in sociology from the University of California, Davis, and several certificates in cross-cultural competence. She also has a fabulous email called awestruckliving.com, I think, right? She's going to be providing, pardon me? It's awestruckliving.com, isn't it?
Gmail.com.
Oh, it's Gmail.
Yeah.
awestruckliving@gmail.com. Okay. Anyway, it's depicting of who she is as a wonderful individual and great speaker. And she's going to be giving a series of classes this semester, which you might want to sign up for. There's the American Voices series, which has 6 different sessions, one on Black voices, one on 2 sessions on Indigenous voices, and then LGBT voices. And then one on Think You Don't Like Podcasts, one on Laughter, the Medicine for the Spirit, and the final is No One's Slave, Hidden Communities in the Antebellum South. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Molly, and thank you so much for participating.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am so grateful to the OLLI program for this opportunity. It's great to see you all and to kick off the fall term. With so many of us getting used to using Zoom, isn't this fabulous? I have to say, secretly, one of my favorite things about using Zoom is I get to look at the backgrounds in people's homes. It's just, I mean, I end up reading the bookshelves, you know, okay, what is that title called? And or the paintings on the walls. It's a way for me to do what this whole session today is about, and in little bitty ways to expand my knowledge of the breadth of humanity's diversity. That's what we're about here today, to talk about that. And I'm just grateful for this opportunity to do so with you. I'm going to start a PowerPoint in a moment so that you can see things as I go along speaking about them. And as Kim has said, I've also prepared a Word document that has on it the practices I've used over the years to broaden myself past the limitations of my own sites of privilege, and with a set of resources. And I want to make sure that I leave time to talk about those resources with you as well. So keeping an eye on the clock as well as going forth with this very exciting topic. Excuse me, the recent air quality problems have been definitely affecting me. So I will actually probably have to clear my throat a good deal of the time. This is an amazing time we're in right now, where we're facing so many major challenges. To me, always primary among them is the climate crisis. It overlays and is the central point for me in what drives my life, which is to cultivate over time more and more awarenesses of how to respect life. And I started out as an environmental activist as a child. At the age of 12, started joining environmental organizations. And so that is a very strong part of my life, though it's not what I'm talking about here today, except that this whole talk today and the classes that I teach go along with, as Jane said, my email address, Awestruck Living, because I consider this beautiful life we live to be an absolute source of awe over and over and over again. But also that this society we are immersed in has this deficit of respect for life in many different ways. And it's showing up now with the responses to COVID-19, with the great divides in our country of who has access to good medical care and so forth, just coming into starker relief than ever. because of COVID response. And of course, the ongoing centuries-long struggle over racial justice that right now has taken a significant turn that I'm going to be talking about as we go along as well. But first, I want to give thanks to the Wiyot people. We are standing on Wiyot land, and I'm very grateful to the people who have survived among the Wiyot with their graciousness in holding the high ground in how to live with other peoples. They certainly do a fabulous job of that. And when we get to talking about practices that I have used over the years, that will feature in a little bit too. I'll get back to that idea of how to honor the Wiyot for their honoring of life. And then also my thanks to the extraordinary centuries of very courageous African Americans who have led the way over and over and over again in how we can live with dignity and acknowledge this extraordinary gift of freedom that is part of the set of ideals that our country is based upon. I grew up during the civil rights era and watched that movement and the incredible courage it took the people to live forth their conviction that they were equally dignified, honorable people, how that came into the American dialogue in that time through their extraordinary courage and efforts. And I want to point out that that civil rights movement led to a whole succession of civil rights movements that are still going on in our time, based upon that template of what so many courageous African Americans began. And I think we're in another time period about that now, where finally, in my thinking, is for the first time in American history, we're talking about the systemic sources or the holding places of privilege and lack of privilege, not just the individual sites where those reside in people, but the systems that hold these privileges in place. As Jane mentioned, I have a master's degree in sociology from UC Davis, and a lot of my, all my work really there was based upon studying systems of privilege and how the ways they talk about themselves, their ideologies, perpetuate those systems of privilege. And it got me thinking about how to undo that in my own life, and helping through my courses as a sociologist then and later on as a minister also, to help people undo these sites of privilege in any way that they feel comfortable doing so. And it's quite a journey. So I'm thankful to both our native people here locally and to the whole extraordinary array of courageous African Americans who've led the way in this process. So I'm going to call up the PowerPoint now and share my screen with you so that we can, there we go, move on to talk through the actual things I want you to be able to see. Is everyone seeing the screen share now? I know you're all muted, so if someone's back there, yeah, okay, good. People are able to, and I will at some point, after I go through the basics of the framework of this, I definitely will open it up to questions, and then since you know how to unmute yourself, we'll go on from there. But as you see here, this topic is largely based upon my own personal journey to come to know more of what I call the garden of human cultures. To me, we are an extraordinary, beautiful garden of so much diversity, so much to celebrate, so much to learn about. It would take many more lifetimes than one to be able to accomplish that. And I know in my 72 years that I've just barely cracked the surface of this extraordinary planet-wide experience of so much difference that all comes together to be a part of who we are as magnificent beings having this human experience. There are cultures, there are ways of being, there are choices in life, and all of them play into every individual life and in the ways they seek community and their ways of expressing themselves in the world. So all those different facets play into it here, which is why I think it's useful to have a framework, which I'll introduce in a moment, that will help us sort of navigate this enormous terrain. So why? Why in this time? Why now? Why talk about privilege? Well, it's part of the national conversation we're having right now, which I think is wonderful yet again. But from me personally, and I think for all of you, it comes from our basic sense of decency and fairness. And as it says here, you know, as well as I, that systems of privilege do great harm to people and limit the life choices of millions. And at the same time, which is less talked about, that these systems of privilege impoverish our society as a whole. I try to imagine how many great scientists and artists and political thinkers and all different kinds of writers and speakers never have received the opportunities that they so richly deserved as human beings. And therefore, our whole society has been impoverished by the fact that they didn't get the education to become an engineer, to develop that thing we don't even know about because they never got the opportunity to develop it. So for me, the ways in which privilege produces impoverishment of the whole society is one of the driving forces in my life. And I hope, and I know for many of you that these same ideas are going forward. We are all here primarily because we are already doing this kind of work. It's one of the ironies, perhaps, of such a program as this, that only those who already see the value in it would come. So it's preaching to the choir, as it's called, but I'm glad to do that, particularly today, because I think there might be certain practices that I get to bring to you that might not have occurred to you yet that you're excited to know about. So let's go into talking about how we face our privilege first. Some of you may have read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. Now, this conversation I'm having with you today is about more than racial privilege, but it's always a good grounding place for our discussion, largely because in the United States, I would say that's our basic national conversation. The black-white divide, it's been, the whole conversation's been distilled down to this thing, the black-white divide, that of course is perhaps the most central topic that defines the United States, the enslavement of millions of people from Africa and their relation to the population that came to be known as white. But that black-white dichotomy or duality is a mask for what's really, as you know, much more complex. There are many, many more kinds of people of color in the United States than African Americans and Euro Americans. But it's a place to begin, and a lot of the resources that I've used and you have seen out there, such as White Fragility, tend to talk about it in terms of that basic divide. What I'm hoping to help you be able to do, and perhaps you're already really well versed at it, and I'm again preaching to the choir, is to extrapolate from that frame of reference into looking at many different ways in which privilege shows up in your life and in mine. So let's talk about some basics of how to approach this idea. First, of course, with honesty. We are all immersed in this social ocean of inequity. No one is free of it. It's the air we breathe as Americans, and perhaps in other places too. And I'll say right now, I'm not going to try to talk about the whole rest of the world because it's just too much to take in. So I am focusing my attention, and much of my research over the past 50 years has been on the United States situations with different forms of privilege. We can do this. And honesty is the best beginning place in our own lives and in dealing with others. That may lead to, and I can't see how you can avoid it, going in and out of states of grief. Grief is an important emotion, as long as you don't let it paralyze you. One of the gifts, I think, of this kind of process of examining one's privilege is to be able to have the full range of emotions that it brings up. And so I would encourage you, when you feel a sense of grief coming up from perhaps some of the research you'll do from resources you learn about today, that you give yourself time to process all of that and you don't shove it aside. It's a very important tool. It's an empathy tool, among other things. And it's, of course, honoring yourself, which is important to do if you intend to honor other people. Then when the grief clears again, and I go in and out of it, and I can't predict when it's going to come up, but I work through it, and then I come back out. Usually it can lead me into a sense of curiosity yet again. And these are the questions that drive me. What can I learn from this latest round of investigations of privilege or people without it? What can I get from it that allows me to grow as a person? And also, as I contact people in different organizations and in different situations of privilege or lack thereof, who might I meet that I haven't gotten to know yet? So these are opportunities to live with a sense of curiosity, and that can then lead you to gratitude and even joy. I am grateful always for the opportunity to release the limitations in my life that the privileges I have, as they say, enjoyed, which I have, lead me to. It's a both and. A privileged place is both a set of things to enjoy that others don't have, perhaps, but also it's a set of limitations. And I'm going to talk about that as we go along as well. And the joy, to me, always comes from learning more about and asserting that everyone and embracing everyone in this concept of the full humanity that every person is a piece of as a human project on this earth. We can learn and grow and become more better stewards of the life around us and have greater respect for life itself from this kind of process of facing privilege. So then the question I want to get back to just briefly is why now and why us? The now I've somewhat answered, but I give thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement in particular for foregrounding the idea of systems of privilege that weave together institutions based on privilege, that form a webwork, a stranglehold really, on all of us. And I have not seen this dialogue put this way before. Usually, in all the years since I paid attention to the civil rights movement back in the late 50s and beyond, it was put in terms of individual rights. And that was important for the civil rights movement. Absolutely. If you don't have the right to vote, you don't have a voice. And so it's important in a civil society to work on civil rights. But that's a very limited view. And now I'm very excited, partly because I'm trained as a sociologist, to see this opportunity and seize this opportunity to talk about the systems that interlock and hold us all captive to a system that we may not prefer as it resides, as it plays out in the world. And why us? Well, here we are. And I'd say for the most part, those of you here on this, in this Zoom room today or are listening by phone, are aware of your own privilege to some degree. And so we have opportunities to use that. This moment is indeed a gift, and we may have privilege to have access to certain resources that those we wish to be embracing in the human family more fully may not have. it's historically been true that persons who were under or unprivileged did not have access to get their voices and their histories heard. For example, it came to light just before President Trump was going to visit Tulsa, Oklahoma, that they were about to commemorate the destruction of the whole section of Tulsa that was filled with Black-owned businesses that had happened a century before. Now, that history's been out there, and lots of Black people around the country were well aware of it. I don't think so many of us with white privilege were aware of that situation in Tulsa. And in fact, dozens and dozens of Black established towns and parts of cities were absolutely razed to the ground in different decades over time, because for African Americans to stand up and say, we have abilities and we can achieve and we can create success, was a great threat to the white population around them. So that history is not well known among those of us who would call ourselves racially privileged. And I would say we need to look at what the word privilege means. As I said before, it's actually an impoverishment, because we don't know enough of our own history quite often to be able to have a reasonable opinion, a well-informed opinion about these topics. So now is a time, finally, when the people who publish books and the people who make movies, the people with the money, because always you follow the money and you'll find out a lot, they have finally seen there's a market for other voices. And now is a time when more people who have not been traditionally privileged have access to have their voices heard. But we have had that privilege all along. We just simply haven't had the knowledge usually to go with it. So there's this beautiful confluence point of other voices finally being heard more in various forms of media, and their histories being told more. And we still have greater privilege, most of us here in this Zoom room and around the country, to bring that information forward as we learn it and embrace it. And we're more likely to be believed as well. When a person of color complains about racial injustice, they can easily be seen as complainers, or why are you bringing that up? That happened a century ago, or whatever. All those things that happen to shut down the conversation are more likely to happen to the person who is seeking to talk to the privileged than it does for those of us with privilege to say, hey, no, I'm noticing this, and my sense of fair play says we ought to address it. So we have a little bit of power there too. And I'd say just basically we're good folks, and we don't want unfair advantages. Now, where I'm going to go next is to talk to you about this schema I developed when I was in sociology, the sociology department at UC Davis as a grad student, that is framing the rest of what I will want to bring to you today. But it's based here, as you see, on these 5 statements: that white people benefit from racism, men benefit from sexism, straight people benefit from gender bias, the able-bodied benefit from ableism, and middle to upper class people benefit from holding the working class and the poor where they are. So that's the kind of general schema to begin to talk about this framing that I want to spend a little time on. And after I talk about the framing, I'm going to open it up to questions. So make sure you guys have a chance to cement what I've said in the first half or so of this conversation today. So these 3 topics are where I'm going next. Getting whammed in the USA is the wham is what I call the framework that I developed as a grad student at UC Davis about privilege and the lack thereof in the United States. And I will unpack that for you in a moment. And that naturally leads in to some of the personal stories from my own life and how the wham framework is useful, and it's proved useful in my life for unpacking some of my own privilege and finding ways to learn past the limitations of that privilege. And then I hope for a good half the time, I want to talk to you about practices for waking up and resources that I have used to do that. So this is maybe the number one thing I want you to remember. It's absolutely critical that this is not about who's good and who's bad. First of all, I don't believe there's such a thing as a bad person. I believe there are people who act in ways that are very damaging to others that you could call bad, absolutely. It doesn't mean they're bad people. They're often in fear. They've been educated to fear. They have been taught that there's not enough of whatever they're looking at for everybody, which I don't think is ever the case. But they basically are running on the thing that in humans is most dangerous, which is fear. And so it's not good people versus bad people. And everyone here in this Zoom room today, whether by phone or video, is a good person. I'm convinced of it, or you probably wouldn't be here and listening to all of this anyway. You're not just good people, you're good people who do good things in the world. This is not then an exploration of our shame and guilt. Those are very unhelpful emotions. Now, I said before, and I'll say again, absolutely, when feelings come up, whatever they are, grief or shame, guilt, frustration, anger, all of it, absolutely. Feel it, have it be a part of your exploration of how to be more effective in the world. These are really legitimate things. All our emotions are. I simply would ask you not to act into the world based on shame or based on guilt, because they are not helpful in talking to other people or involving yourself in organizations. And certainly it is not something we want to do to burden those around us who haven't got the privileges we have by saying to them, we're ashamed that we have such privilege. It just doesn't sound good to the person on the receiving end. And this we're hearing more and more. You may be hearing it more and more through the media, that, for example, African-American folks simply don't want to hear about our shame and guilt any longer. They haven't wanted to for a long time, but now more of them are willing to say so, and I'm very glad that they are, because shame and guilt are unhelpful emotions in going forward, and they are ours to process privately, not to ask the other to forgive us for. That's a terrible burden to place on someone whose life has already been burdened by the lack of privilege. And again, I remind you, we are all immersed in this societal web work of privilege and the lack thereof. So what we're about here today is learning to free ourselves in order that we may have greater ability to help free others by our humility, our curiosity, our joy, and our honesty. So with those ideas and with the recognition that shame and guilt can have a place in our conversation today, perhaps, if you're, want to air it when I open this up to questions, absolutely. But if you're in conversation with a person who's been on the downside of some site of privilege, that is not the place to unload that. And I have a couple of quotes for you from, of course, the magnificent James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced, is basic. And then the wonderful poet Audre Lorde, in a conversation she had at a national conference in 1981, and I cut this down. I cannot hide my anger to spare you guilt, nor hurt nor feelings, nor answering anger, for to do so insults and trivializes all our efforts. Guilt becomes a device to protect ignorance and the continuation of things the way they are, the ultimate protection for changelessness. Now, if that concept doesn't quite resonate with you, I would urge you to read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. It's a marvel of a book about the ways in which, in this case, of course, the black-white dualism, which is the basic theme in America in so many ways, and it can be extrapolated into all these other areas of privilege, which is what we'll do with it today. But in her book, she's very clear that there are so many unconscious ways that white people avoid recognizing and unpacking their own privilege, and guilt is definitely a way in which many people do that, though they are not using it with that conscious intent that is in fact what happens from it. So that's why I mentioned use the Audrey Lorde quote here for you. So I'm going to go through the framework here for you that I developed in the 90s when I was a grad student in sociology. And after I go through this framework, I'm going to be glad to open up the conversation so that you can ask questions. So what is this thing, this wham thing? Getting whammed in the United States or in America is, the wham is the idealized American citizen. What all of us are expected to assimilate toward, this is in terms of course, ideology, actual lived experience, the way institutions operate, the way systems keep us bound. This is what they are keeping us bound to. Wham is white, heterosexual, able-bodied, middle class, and male. So I developed a lecture about this that I went around and did in various colleges when I was a grad student in sociology, talking about this wham process. And I really like the way it sounds like a wallop. And so I want to unpack this a little bit for you, because each of these letters is standing for a whole array of things that are underneath it. White is not just the category of whiteness itself as a racial category. First off, let me say, there's no such thing as a white person. This is a social construct. Race is not biological. Genetically, we are all one species. Race has been created through the European into the American project of enslavement, basically, to define those who own and those who are owned. And the word white wasn't even used in any sense of meaning people until this project of across the Atlantic slave trade developed in European nations. And so when I look at my skin, I think, well, if I were hired to make sure all the linens for some big hotel were spotlessly white, and I produced linens the color of my skin, I'd get fired. This is not white. This is not even close to white. Basically, white is a non-category. As I say, you can read the history of its development in the 1600s as a concept that was brand new at the time. So much as we say race is a social construct, it's important, I think, to say whiteness itself is a social construct within that category of race. But I'm using it here for more than race. It also stands in for ethnicity, for culture, and within culture, it can be religion, it can be region of origin. For some parts of our history, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Catholic Americans in general were not perceived as white Americans. It's changed over time what the concept means. And of course, anti-Semitism still rears its ugly little head quite often in the United States, and to some people, Jewish people will never be perceived as fully white. So you can play with it yourself and complexify this idea of white. Just the W is standing in for so much more. And that's going to be true of all of these categories. The concept of H is for heterosexual is similar. It actually stands in for gender presentation and identification in so many different ways. And of course, in our society until recently, gay marriage was not permitted. And there's been this huge national dialogue that moved very rapidly after 100 years of seeming to get nowhere on this topic of opening up to LGBTQ differences and accepting people who are within those different categories by choice. We still have ways to go, of course, for many people, but the standard is still going toward this idea of heterosexuality. And I would mention one person in my life who was a part of that, opening up that for me. I don't ever remember his name even anymore. I haven't known him since the 90s, as I was actually 80s probably, as I was going into grad school to study gender primarily, though other sites of dominance as well. He was a great resource because he was a dear friend. He and his wife both were dear friends of myself and my partner, and very much a committed husband, and identified as heterosexual fully. Yet his manner in the world was so gentle, and he had a slight lisp in his speech. And since he was very young, he had been bullied a lot by the assumption that he was a gay man. And so he has used that throughout his life to understand the strictures of this heterosexualizing, if you will, of people, that is the normal, the ideal, the way to be if you want to be fully realized as the best, as being worthy of full humanity. So it plays out that way in terms of gender presentation and in terms of your own sense of yourself. Gay, straight, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex, all of these things play into that. So again, this H is standing in for a lot. Able-bodied, I think you can imagine it standing in for a lot, of course, obviously. I prefer the term diffability, D-I-F-F hyphen ability to disability, because these are differences. And so it would include the basics of the classic disabilities of blindness, deafness, wheelchair-bound people, also illnesses like cystic fibrosis, or mental, psychological differences like developmentally delayed folks or autistic folks on the spectrum, or people with mental illnesses such as bipolar folks, schizophrenic people labeled that anyway. And all of these are part of the able-bodiedness or outside of that. And so to be perceived as the idealized American citizen, you are perceived as able-bodied, and that creates problems for those who struggle with other. We've seen that, of course, through the Americans with Disabilities Act, just access to getting past a staircase if you live in a wheelchair. We've come a long way in this area as well, but we always have a lot more we can do. The first of the two M's is a bit problematic because really Americans don't aspire to middle class. We really aspire to upper middle class, but I didn't like the U there. I think Huam just didn't do anything for me as a label. So I decided to keep the M for middle class and then explain it, which is what I'm doing now. So Americans, particularly in this capitalist society that's so based on money and the acquiring of money as your success, good luck charm, if you will, because of course you can lose money that you've got. It doesn't solve every problem. But there's this understanding driven by our capitalist economy, economic system, that becoming upper middle class is the ideal for everyone. We don't, at least in our talk about ourselves, aspire to upper class. That sort of gets problematic again. It gets a little bit toward, looking toward the systems of nobility in Europe and who's entitled more than others. And yet at the same time, certain individuals who earn extraordinary amounts of money are totally lionized in our society. So we have a kind of a mixed feeling about that. So basically, I think most people would aspire to this ideal of upper middle class as the comfortable way to live in the society. And then of course, the final M, very obviously male. We see that with the idea of the glass ceiling in business and other places where this divide that we call sexism really does produce differences in life experience and the opportunities for success for men versus women. One example I was talking to someone earlier about is that actually it was with Kim and with Jane before the session started. I'm 72 and part of about half my income is from Social Security. And yet because I was a woman earner during all the years in which the tallies were being put together that now produce the benefits I receive from Social Security, I was being paid roughly 2/3 of what I would have been paid if I had been male. Now I receive about 2/3 of what I ought to have been getting, should be getting now from Social Security, because a whole system of sexism was in place to keep me from earning what was my due as a person employed in the United States. So you see how all these things play out individually, but also notice they interact. I can't think of too many more difficult positions to be in than being, let's say, a Latina, transgender, blind person. You know, there you got the wham is really on you in multiple dimensions at once. So you can play with these things. Play is probably not the best verb to use there. You can assess these various categories and think of them in terms of how they affect all Americans, and all of us in our lives. And I'm going to ask you, one of the practices that I'm going to talk about next using this schema is to produce a timeline of your own life in terms of privilege based on these categories and others that you might want to add in. It's something I'll talk about a little bit more. So basically, I'm going to switch now to talk about my journey of discovery and this way in which I have built in my head, I've never actually put it on paper, a sense of my own life experience and how it has unfolded in terms of though, if you'd like to ask questions about the schema, I'm going to put it back on screen. Does anyone have questions about this way of looking at society?
I think it'd be useful to go ahead and give your own example, but I mean, we have multiple examples of what's happened with the Native Americans here.
Yep.
I think it's not just the black-white, but I think
No.
we live in a community where we finally are beginning to address our Native American history and
Yep.
allow them space to speak and to be recognized.
Yep.
And I think that would be a very good subject to explore at some point, whether we do it through OLLI or whether we do it through discussions like this.
Yep. Thank you, Jane. I, of course, will be addressing some of that during the 2-week class on indigenous voices. And that's a very good example of what I was saying, where this word white is standing in for so much more than just the black-white conversation. That's such an important American thing. I'll go on with the personal stuff, but know that you're welcome to, I'm just seeing my PowerPoint here. So definitely Jane and Kim can let me know if people are out there wanting to ask questions. So let me go ahead with some of the ways that I've used it to unpack my own life. My first exposure to this concept of racial privilege came very, very young. I was raised in a home where, before I was even conscious of her presence, there was an African-American woman who I was taught to call Anna, and she worked for my mother as a domestic person. We never used the term servant. I never heard my mother use that frame of reference with her. She had been in my mother's parents' home for many years. When I got to know Anna, she was already quite advanced in years, and I considered her a second mother. in many ways. And of course, that relationship became more and more problematic in my heart as I came to understand more and more about the history of racism in America, particularly in the African American, Euro American context. She was in that classic position of not having the power, but being expected to give of her emotions as well as her physical work in the home. And she guarded her emotions quite a bit. I really respect her for that now. As a youngster, when I would call on her in some crying fit at the age of 5 or something, she wasn't the kind of person who would sit down and be motherly and put me on her lap and so forth. She would talk to me about my situation. She was very respectful of my state of mind, but she was not warm and cuddly. And I'm really grateful to her that she didn't do that, because I think now that was a place where she found she could navigate her own sense of dignity in a very undignified relationship. Notice that I was taught to call her Anna. Now, after she retired from working and was no longer a presence in the home I grew up in, and this would have been maybe when I was 10 or 11, my mother then hired a woman I was taught to call Mrs. Gill to do the ironing and hang the laundry out and make the beds and whatever. And you notice, you could probably tell without my saying so, Mrs. Gill was a white woman. She was not of equal class status as my upper middle class family was, because she was working for my mother. But you'll notice the difference. I didn't call her by her first name. Now, I have to tell you that never even occurred to me until earlier this year in a conversation I was having with someone about this stuff about privilege and racial injustice in America. And there was this little aha went through my head, and I said, duh, I was asked to call Anna by her first name, even though she was an elder woman. And yet Mrs. G, as I called her for short, Mrs. Gill, I was expected to call by a more honorable term with using the word term Mrs. That was an unconscious difference, I would suggest, from my parents that they didn't quite get. It also probably has to do with the fact that Anna was a dear person to my mother when she was coming up as a young woman. So she would have learned from my very Victorian grandparents, very much class-based in their thinking and very much privilege-based, that you talk to the servants, if they use that term. I also never heard my grandparents use that term, but I'll use it here as a shorthand. To call the people who worked for you by their first names is, it's a classic in English society, and my parents have come from that English side of things. I'm a WASP, a New England WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, all sides of my family. So, but that difference right there of Anna versus Mrs. Gill, Mrs. G, is very telling, that I never noticed that until this past year. We're always unpacking this stuff. All of us have these sites of unconscious privilege in our thinking. It is nothing to be ashamed of. It is something to be excited about when we discover a little bit more of it, because we are unpacking our own chains, untangling our own chains in order to free ourselves, to help free the rest of the world. So in terms of heterosexuality, I grew up in the 1950s. Need I say more? There was Liberace, and what was he about? And it was very confusing. There was all this quiet silencing of discussion about the whole topic. And of course, it changed over the decades. But the stereotype of how gay men were supposed to act, as it affected this man I told you about in my life decades later, that's something you may want to look at, and how your life is unfolded and the people you've known and the situations you've been in. Able-bodied, that comes strongly into my life at a very young age, elementary school. My non-biological brother, I still think of him very much as a brother, Steve, came into my life. We were both in elementary school together. He was part of a program that the elementary school ran for developmentally delayed children. He was in that program, and they met in what all of us in that elementary school were taught to call the ungraded room. Now, if that isn't a stigma, what were these teachers thinking to even use such a term? And we all use the term all the time. And so I observed early on, maybe second, third grade, that Steve was forever being put upon and attacked by bullies for being the sweethearted, somewhat mentally slower than others person that he still is. And I just took him on as someone to protect. And I spent a lot of time with him, protecting him from bullies during recess and after school. We became really good friends. He started coming home with me after school. And my dad took him under his wing, taught him how to do everything manly in the garage that had to do with tools and vehicles. Steve got a wonderful job with the city I grew up in, and he had that job for over 30 years and retired with full benefits, was married for 50 years. Just this past spring, his wife of 50 years passed away. Her name was Cindy. He's still my brother of the heart, very much so. So that was my start. And of course, there are other people along the way who I've known with physical or mental and psychological differences. And this is a category to unpack if you wish to do this timeline thing in your own life. Class, that's a harder one usually to talk about for a lot of us, because we've been taught that it's not something comfortable to talk about with other people. Our class status changed in my childhood. My dad was from a working class, middle class family of educators. Teachers still are often not paid particularly well, but they had a certain status of respect. So it was a little mixed position they had. My mom comes right out of upper class New England, from royal governors of the colony of Rhode Island before it was a state, and all of that history of having wealth and prestige both. So my mom married down in class when she married my dad, but he was in medical school and planning to become a doctor. He never earned a huge lot of money at it. He didn't need to. He was, very well established as a physician, always kept his prices low for physical exams and so forth. He used to say, I don't need to get rich off this. I'm doing very fine, thank you. We've got a good home and everything we need. So we had an upper middle class life. My mom hated being an upper class kid. She was forced to go to coming out parties where she was on display as just the latest young woman to be a good marriage possibility. And she just hated the whole way it was organized. She really disliked the upper class folks that she was related to, and we hardly ever spent time with most of them because she simply didn't respect a lot of the family she came from. So I was taught a very all-American, middle-class, honoring way of looking at class in America. All of that hid what was really underneath it, that when you come with a lot of privileges and money and education, that those are advantages that are going to carry through the generations. None of that was talked about. And then, of course, the last one, I'm not male, and that one showed up second, I would say, no, third. First came, of course, my awareness of Anna as not a white person at a very young age. Then came my awareness of the discussion of who's able-bodied as I came to know Steve in the second or third grade in elementary school. But third after that, around the age of 11 or 12, I was first shocked into discovering sexism. And that's because I was a very, very physically active kid. I was climbing trees and outside all the time, never wanted to go indoors. I was a wild child in a lot of ways. And of course, it was called a tomboy, which goes back to the H for heterosexual part. Tomboys, you know, that term has interesting meaning in terms of the LGBTQ way of looking at the world we have now. At the time, it simply meant I was an aberrant girl. And I enjoyed the status of it just fine because I liked being an outdoors person. And I was, as I say, very physically active. And one of the things I was really good at was sandlot baseball. And so I was all excited, whatever that spring was, I guess when I turned 11, driving by the ball field where they were going to have tryouts for Little League. And I said, Mom, would you bring me back on Saturday so that I can try out for Little League? And she almost ran off the road. She was so shocked. And I still remember the tone of her voice saying, you can't do that. You're a girl. And I remember thinking, what? What has that got to do with the fact that I'm one heck of a ball player? I mean, I wouldn't have put it probably in those words even in my head at the age of 11, but I still remember my confusion that something to do with something meaningless as the biology that labeled me would have anything to do with my ability to be a part of a team. So that I became, the joke is, you know, instantly a feminist to that point. And it's quite literally true. And from that moment on, I started looking at the world through this lens of who gets to be more real as an American person. And of course, the status of male comes from that. So that's the way it's played out in my life, just a snippet of it. It could, you know, I could spend days, I could talk to you for an entire semester on just the building of this timeline for myself of how I've been whammed in America. So now I'd like to open up the lines to what your suggestions have been for how you want to build a timeline or your experiences of the wham.
So I would like to, there are a couple of comments and a question in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and, Jasmine, if you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I wasn't going to ask a question. I was also going to bring attention to the questions in the chat that Roland asked regarding the WOMP.
So Roland asked or stated, there's an increasing scientific evidence that a lot of human behavior is genetically controlled. So much of life is a question of luck, who your parents are, where you were born and raised. Does the science of human behavior raise issues about your approach to WHAM?
I'm not quite sure how to talk about that. It's all behavioral. Like I said before, we're all good people. Some of us don't act it out well in the world based on our fear. I don't think of sociology as the behavioral sciences in quite that sense either, because it's an aggregate science that talks about how groups of people, rather than individuals, play out these behaviors. Of course, they're all individually focused as well. But I need us to get away from thinking about it in terms of individual behavior. Once we get past building our own timeline, which is something you might want to do, at least little snippets of it here and there, because basically the ways in which we treat each other are based, as that quote said, with what we have learned and what we have been taught, what we come from by, you can call the accident of birth. But the accident of birth is based upon these systems, and those can be changed because those are socially constructed. I hope that helps.
Yeah, Julie, I don't know if she's still here because she did say she had to leave, but she also made a comment that she loved that question. And also she once played with the odds of being born in this time and in this place and being white. And she said it was in the trillions. So
yeah.
Yeah, and then Wheaton Griffin says that nature, nurture has been a question man has researched since the first human asked, why do we? The relative impact of genetics, social forces, culture, inner values, drives, etc., will continue to be studied long after we are done thinking about it. Thus, WHAM is as relevant as any other approach to seeking answers to human questions like why do we?
Yeah, so we have opportunities wherever we are on the idealized framework scale to change the ways in which we interact with other people. And so that's really what I'm talking about today, how we take what we've been given and work with it to embrace the greater sum of humanity as a part of who we all are, rather than having so many fear reactions to those differences. So this is a kind of a celebration talk, I hope. Thanks.
Go ahead, Wheaton. Can you unmute yourself there? Let's see.
Unmute. Okay, unmute. Okay, it took me 7 hours. Thank you. Hey, Kate, I see that you've studied this very carefully and diligently and deeply. Thank you for bringing your questions and some of your findings to us. I, too, am very, very, very involved in understanding and trying to correct racism. I've been very fortunate to be included in some groups that are mostly Black, and I'm learning a lot.
Yeah.
I was kind of a hard one to convince that I was racist because I had a particular background that involved a lot of Black friends and colleagues, and I had a little bit of a different background.
Yeah.
So this shit doesn't apply to me, but it does, and I have racism that I pretty well denied and put off to the side, and I'm glad I understand it now or see it more and more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. So I have a question for you, though, in your studies that kind of I'm curious about. Why is it all of a sudden? I mean, we've been killing and raping and tormenting and caging and chaining Black people as soon as we got our first 100 in our control. I mean, we've been doing it for a long time, well before America. Why all of a sudden do you think that we care? I mean, there's white people, me, that I've always cared, but now I care differently. And there's people that never cared, and all of a sudden they're putting down their cocktail at the 19th hole and think, well, what do you think about this racism issue? And the whole country's kind of into this thing right now. But why do you think that is, Molly?
I love that question, Wheaton. Thank you. To me, this the sacrifice of George Floyd was a pivotal moment, as were the visuals of the civil rights movement. If you're old enough to remember, it was a shock to a lot of us to see on the evening news people being attacked with police dogs and being slammed to the pavement by the force of the water coming out of fire hoses. That just was a visceral recognition of common humanity. And I think that same thing hit us again in May with the heartbreaking killing of George Floyd. He's certainly not the first or the last person to be killed by authorities, whether vigilantes or those authorized as police. But this was a pivotal moment because we watched him die on screen. And I think that is one of those moments where the sense of common humanity just grips lots of more people. I think that's why.
Jasmine, you have a question?
Thank you. That makes sense, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have a question. I was gonna hop on to answer that question. As somebody in a younger generation, maybe I have a different point of view. I believe that this has brought more attention has been brought to this because of the technology we have. Like,
yep,
we have more people having an opportunity to speak on it, more people to have a voice and to say, like Ms. Kate was saying earlier. We have more opportunity to express our voices. So
yes,
of course, more attention is going to be brought to it when more people are speaking about it. We're united more, if anything. I mean, I wouldn't say united, but we're stronger as a whole. We're stronger when we're united. And when we're united, we speak up. And I believe that's the reason.
Wonderful. It's absolutely true, Jasmine. We wouldn't have had this visual of George Floyd's murder if we hadn't had people there with the cameras in their phones to film it. So you're absolutely right. These things came together. In the 50s, it was TV cameras in black and white. Now it's just expanded through so many other kinds of people. Thank you
Exactly.
all.
It's personal experiences.
Yep.
Mhm.
And this is what it takes. We have to feel the other to stop seeing that person as the other, right?
Empathy.
Empathy, that's probably the basic word here. I'm going to move on now to make sure I get through the rest of this. But by all means, keep asking questions if you like. I've talked about my journey of discovery, and now I want to talk about practices for waking up, as I call it here. And again, there's this document I've created with all the list of these practices, plus all the resources I want to get through in the next 25 minutes to briefly give you a little information about. But that document has been created as a Word doc, and it's ready to send out by the OLLI team for all of you if you wish it. So the first practice was the one I was just talking about, to, if you wish, build a timeline, whether in your mind or on a piece of paper, for seeing how your life has played out in terms of various places of privilege, various places of lack of privilege that go to make up your individual life experience. So let's talk about other ways we can then use that timeline and other practices we can use. What I did with my timeline as I developed it mentally was to learn how privilege operates, one category after another, whether it was able-bodiedness, because I knew how Steve's life was different from mine, or what it was like for me as a female person in a male-dominant society. Just learning. This is a lifelong learning program. And so absolutely, this is something we can do with it. There are lots more possibilities now for learning from different cultures and ways of being, because more people are being published from formerly silenced ways of being and ways of life and cultures. You can find so many different sites and sources, and I'll be talking about that in the resources section too. But you've got books and movies and podcasts and TED Talks and so many different ways to go about this. So it can be overwhelming, but if you pick out one part of a category that you'd like to pursue, you can go for it, as I like to say, like a beagle, just going forth to follow that scent wherever it will take you. You can also attend events that are put on by people from different cultures and different senses of privilege or lack thereof. When I was involved in the UC Davis community, I had the opportunity to go lots of cultural events, the Hmong student group, the Hawaiian student group, the LGBTQ community. I volunteered at the Cross Cultural Center. I mean, but so we're doing it by Zoom a lot now, but you can attend events that are put on by people from different cultures and different ways of being. The number one that I was raised with as a child is this one here, to stand in a person's shoes. That, of course, means learning more about privilege and lack thereof and how it shows up based on the WHAM or any other category set you might want to use to investigate it. But this is where empathy comes in, as Jasmine was just saying, where we get to imagine ourselves into a life situation, into a place of lack of privilege, and see what it feels like with our imaginations to be there. We can also use the places in our lives that are less privileged, such as myself as a female in a male-dominant society, to extrapolate for the places where I am more privileged. We can bring those ideas into conversation with each other to learn more about how it is to stand in the shoes of someone else. This next one is a phrase from Sharon Black, the president of the NAACP chapter locally. She uses this term and did at her OLLI presentation a few weeks ago, to use your sphere of influence, so that as you learn things and grow in your own sophistication toward how your privilege has operated in the world, or places where you haven't felt privileged, that you can be a place of influence in your circle of friends and family, perhaps. Sometimes family is the hardest ones to talk to. But I love her phrase, using your sphere of influence. So I wanted to make sure I included that here. Then here again, just to mention again, your own personal reflection, perhaps building your own timeline or understanding and exploring your own journey of discovery is a very powerful place from which to do this work. And then one of the things I most loved learning as a grad student in sociology at UC Davis was to develop a critical assessment of media of all kinds and of received history. Recently has come to light, and I'm so honoring the Sierra Club for putting out publicity saying they have recently uncovered that John Muir was a racist. So you can go to their website presumably and find more. I haven't actually done that. I heard it on the news, and I looked up John Muir to find more about that. And but I presume that the Sierra Club is teaching people about that. And also recently, the great Ralph Waldo Emerson has come to light as a racist as well. So what I like about that, and what I think is important about that, is that these folks have been elevated above us as heroes. And I think it's really important for us to know they're just people like us, that all of us have places. Yes.
Audubon as well.
Audubon, oh yeah, he must have, well, aside from shooting all those birds, it always bothered me a lot that that was the way he did his work. I understood, though, that this time he saw them as endlessly prolific in numbers, and so it's a little different than if you were doing it now. But Audubon, thank you. I didn't know about him. This is good. We need to know that all of us are people. All of us have places where we shine and places where we don't. And the good side of this is knowing that we too can be our best selves in the world, even through working out these places where privilege has been something we've used unconsciously, perhaps, to get where we are. And also, in terms of critical assessment, very important is to notice the language used, as well as the visuals that are used, if you're talking about video media. Language choices such, is this a protest or is this a riot? Are these freedom fighters or are these people terrorists? The language gets used in very insidious ways, and I know many of you are pretty sophisticated about that. But you can use that in terms of the way people are talked about in these categories as well. Are certain people who are in African-American communities protesting? Are they dangerous people? Are they anarchists? Are they, you know, this is, the language can be very heated up, as it is lately in Washington quite often. And it's important for us to always notice and unpack that for ourselves, where the language is being used in an insidious way to denigrate people without having to say so. One of my favorite examples that I used actually to write a paper, because it happened while I was in the social department at UC Davis, was then President George, the first George Bush, would constantly talk about Saddam Hussein. The man's name is Saddam. And I did a whole paper on the homophobia of his mispronunciation of the name Saddam. Sodom, of course, means sodomy to us, means Sodom and Gomorrah. It has nothing but negative connotations to it. So the mispronunciation of that first name, which he did hundreds and hundreds of times during his presidency, was fascinating to me as an example of how you twist people's feelings about a situation in the world by simply mispronouncing one single word. Then, of course, you can build relationships. Once you've learned enough, I'd say starting at the top of how your privilege operates and learning from different cultures and finding your way to a sense of celebration and honoring without having to bring in your own guilt or shame or whatever, but just to celebrate and be a part of other groups. Build relationships with organizations and individuals who are expressing and from communities that are different from your own. This is a very important way to move forward in waking up. And then, of course, one of my favorites I've done all my life is to see the world you walk in with different eyes. I have a habit wherever I go of trying to mentally strip away all of what we call development and see the ground, the trees, the forest, the water, as it might have appeared to the first indigenous inhabitants who walked there. I had a great advantage in that. My maternal grandfather used to take me for walks in the woods near where I lived in Rhode Island. And he would say, you are standing on the winter encampment land of the Passamaquoddy band of the Narragansett Indians. This pond that was in the front of the house I grew up in was a source for them in the winter of fish. And we would occasionally find an artifact on the ground of them. But mostly he taught me to recognize that with every step I took, I was walking on someone else's land. So you can do that anywhere you go. Notice how different the vista might look if you stripped away all the buildings and try to see it the way people did when they lived there, closer to the land, in the way in which they felt themselves a part of the land as well. And also just with historic buildings. If you go to Washington, D.C. and you're looking at our great monuments, you might think, who actually physically built that? For the most part, the people who did were enslaved artisans and enslaved laborers. I give credit to Georgetown University for acknowledging that all of their original buildings were built by enslaved labor. And this is a thing you can do with lots of places you go, just to imagine or research, if you get into it enough, who built that and did they have a choice? More practices. This is my favorite. Before you read this paragraph, I want to explain the transposing thing. The paragraph is from a piece of work of my own. I wrote a short essay that was published as a My Word piece in the Times Standard on the 7th of July, which was in response to the then national debate about monuments and which ones should be removed. And they were talking about the Emancipation Monument in Washington, D.C., which shows a standing Lincoln and African-American man who's on one knee starting to rise up. And Lincoln, of course, did this great gesture of helping this person to rise. And like Frederick Douglass before me, I took a pretty grave exception to the way that thing was created. And this transposing is to take an example from your own privileged life and say, how would that play out if it were put into this situation of people who without privilege? And then the paragraph makes sense, which says, think of World War II movies about captive POWs, such as Bridge on the River Kwai or The Great Escape. If we were to create a monument to either of those events, because those were real events, the escapees would never be depicted as needing elevating. Those films depict free men who know they're free, who continually resist and devise means of escape, who walk on their own 2 feet. And the reason I wrote that into my essay is that I was transposing the experience I'd had just in a movie or two for how this looks now to so many people, including Frederick Douglass, who disliked the way the Emancipation sculpture was created. Now, in that article, I also went on to say, I honor its continuance because I understand that it was paid for by people who had been enslaved. At the time that they were honoring it, they didn't have the mindset we would have now, nor should they have had a century and a half ago. But they put their very, very hard-earned dollars to work in building that monument. I want it to stay. I want it to be honored. I simply would put a few more persons around it, standing figures like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, for example, who are fully standing as present as Lincoln is. But you see how transposing works. You can do that in your own life in lots of different situations. And then translate from your experience. This says Michael's insight. That's my son, Michael. When he was a teenager, he felt put upon in his school because he was a heavy metal kid who wore torn t-shirts and had outrageous hair, and he was ostracized in a lot of different organizations and groups in high school because of it. And he came to me one day and said, I understand more about what it is to be on the out in America as a part of some group that isn't accepted, because I'm going through this in my own way as a heavy metal kid in high school. So you can translate from your own experience, as my dear son did at about the age of 16, to bring this empathy forward. And again, I would just remind people to educate yourself rather than relying on people of color to tell you about racism or so forth, particularly right now with the racial dialogue. A lot of my African-American friends are able and willing now to say more out loud, that they are just simply weary of teaching white people, and it's ours to learn it for ourselves. Also, I like the idea of practicing personal reparations wherever it's possible. And here is where I bring in the WIAT again. There is in our local area this thing that's developed called the WIAT honor tax. You can look it up online. It's a land use tax, if you will, that a person can choose to pay to the WIAT tribe if you wish to do so. And this is a way to do a little bit of reparations that you can do personally. There's no dollar amount for it. It's totally up to the individual. And it's just there as an offering if people choose to. For myself, I contribute to the American Indian Graduate Center. I have 2 master's degrees. I highly prize my education, and I love the idea of supporting particularly Indigenous Americans in getting graduate education so that they have loud voices to support the best for their own people. So there are lots of different ways you can do personal reparations into the world. And of course, part of that would be supporting businesses and arts locally and around the globe that are representing organizations or groups that you're particularly drawn to. Here in Humboldt, I recommend Black Humboldt as an organization. They have a list of Black-owned businesses at their website, and there, I'm sure, are other ones that you can find to do that kind of thing too. So basically, what I'm talking about here is this developing our capacity for dignity for all people, to live our ethics, and to look at this question of what would I want if that other person in that other situation was me. As I did with Steve on the playground as an elementary school student, I sure didn't want to watch him be bullied because I felt it in my heart. So ours is the chance to extend dignity to all people. Let me go through the resources that, again, you have access to both those practices that I just went through and these resources as a Word doc that they can send out from the OLLI office for you. I mentioned white fragility. It's only listed here first because, one, it's available for free. If you haven't read it, it's available online for free as a PDF. It's a great gift Robin DiAngelo has done and the publisher too, to allow the book available for people for free. And for second reason, it's got a pretty darn good resource list of its own at the end of the book. And so the resources that DiAngelo has in her book, I'm not including in mine, because this could just be, a whole encyclopedia in its own right. I particularly highly recommend White Rage by the scholar Carol Anderson. It's a much more hard-hitting book than White Fragility. And in the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, those two together chronicle a lot of the history from across the United States of the actual experiences of African American and Indigenous peoples in this country. Thinking in Pictures is one of the 4 or more books written by the wonderful Temple Grandin on the autistic spectrum, and a great scholar and public speaker about what it is to be on the autistic spectrum. An Unquiet Mind is written by a very courageous psychiatrist. She is bipolar herself and talks about what it is like to live as a bipolar person and the struggle of that. The Women of Brewster Place is on here, as it's a favorite of mine. It's the first book I remember reading from an African-American perspective, and Gloria Naylor's work is always good to know about. Water Lily, another great read. It's available locally, I think in our library system, maybe not. I don't remember, I haven't looked in a while. I own a copy. It's a beautiful book written by a woman from the Lakota tradition of a woman's life in a traditional Lakota village. So you really get a feel for that culture. Of course, the great A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which was the source for the earlier book, Indigenous People's History of the United States, where that title comes from. Dunbar Ortiz did a nod to Howard Zinn in her title. The People's History is a great read. I'll always remember the opening sections on Columbus, the quotes from him saying, "I met these wonderful, kind, beautiful people who brought us food, and they'll make great slaves." Whomp. I mean, you know, right at the very get-go, you see the Euro-American project of exploitation raw. Memory of Fire came to me recently. Eduardo Galeano's beautiful, tragic, heartbreaking trilogy on this unfolding of what Columbus began. How to Be an Anti-Racist is a wonderful book by Ibram Kendi. His earlier book is referenced in White Fragility's resources, but not this most recent one, and it's a really great one. The White Ally Toolkit Workbook is by a Professor Camp. His work as an African-American scholar with people who are wanting to be better white allies is very, very valuable. And of the classic, I had to include Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which is an article, and you can read that for free online as well, which she wrote in the mid-'80s. And it's very, very lovely in the simple depictions of the everyday ways in which white privilege shows up. It's a good short read. The 1619 Project by the New York Times Magazine, many of you probably know about. It's ongoing and a wonderful project. Of course, we've got lots of local history here. I had to foreground Jerry Rody's wonderful work, and lots of articles in the North Coast Journal, particularly lately on women and girls of indigenous cultures who have been murdered or put into enslavement and have been raped, and all of it not being well handled within the judicial system. Some of those articles are very recent. Then these writers, I mean, they're just all of them fabulous. I'm not even going to name them here. You can see a whole bunch. And then what I've done is I've just read across the globe. I would spend several years reading Latin American authors or African American authors, and then African authors, different parts of Asia, Indigenous Australians. Hard time finding a lot in terms of written sources from there, but I'm constantly looking. So what I've spent the last 50 years doing is just reading books from all over the globe, and then it shows up, of course, in the visual media that have developed and now are so easy for us to get online. Netflix is a fabulous source. They have a lot of documentaries. I look for any documentary or drama that's written, directed, or created in a culture other than my own. And as with the books, a lot of what I'll do is, and they can do this with a movie, you could stop it while it's running. Like in a book, you put it down. You say, wait a minute, that character just went through this experience. If it happened in my culture, it wouldn't play out that way. I have to think about this for a minute. So you take what's happening in the book or on the video, and you can actually ask yourself questions about why is their impulse different from what I would expect in my own society. These are ways to open up yourself for the examination of cultural differences. That's really quite exciting. And as it says here under the Netflix category, they have had, I think, 3 films from Basque country. I was astonished to find a thriving film industry, maybe is the right term, or at least collection of films from Basque country. People are rarely talked about. They do have a Black Lives Matter collection, and they have had put out some wonderful films about differently abled people. I recommend almost anything directed by Ava DuVernay. 13th is extremely important. It talks about the 13th Amendment, which of course freed everybody except criminals, which of course set up the next 100 years of talking about African-American men as natural-born criminals. This is where that went. And so there's also the documentary I call here A Conversation With. It's a conversation with Ava DuVernay and Oprah Winfrey about the making of 13th. And then When They See Us, a devastating series that Ava DuVernay did about the very young men called the Central Park Five, who were erroneously for years imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit, and her film Selma. I really recommend you see CAU Yesterday if you wish. It's a lovely fictional film. It's in the realm of science fiction, but it's embedded in the lived experience of some African-American folks, and it's a beautiful movie. I highly recommend it. They Gotta Have Us is a documentary about fame in entertainment industry in the United States, particularly in film, and how African Americans have been portrayed over time. Paris is Burning is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's a documentary on the drag culture in New York in the 1980s that was predominantly gay, Latino, Black, transgender people. It's powerful stuff, and then it has been fictionalized in this series called Pose, which I also love. And then there's the old classic film, The Celluloid Closet, about the portrayals of gay, primarily gay men, but lesbians somewhat too on film. The beautiful movie, I Am Not Your Negro, about James Baldwin. Being Elmo is a sweet one. It's about the African-American man who was hired to portray Elmo in Sesame Street. It's a wonderful thing to watch, and it talks about his life in terms of race and creativity. Hello Privilege, It's Me Chelsea is pretty self-explanatory. Pachamama and Coco are both animated films that are very, very good portrayals of their particular segment of Latin American cultures. Crip Camp is a stupendous documentary about kids who are differently abled, finally able to go to a camp that was just opening them to the idea of freedom. Rising Phoenix is on Netflix right now. It's a beautiful film about the development of the Paralympics. Rabbit Proof Fence is one of many films from Australia talking about indigenous culture there. Stateless is also current at Netflix and from Australia, a devastating series on their and imprisoning, if you will, and camping of people who are refugees. Chef's Table is an unusual one to have here, but I recommend it to you. Over the many seasons of the series Chef's Table, they give individual biographies of chefs, and they're picking people from Latin America, from Asia, who are street food merchants who have become very well known internationally, and you get some of their personal stories. It's quite wonderful. If you're at Netflix and you want to see films on Native Americans, just type in John Trudell's name and see what comes up. He's not only a great poet in his time, but was in several films from his perspective as a Native activist. And then the great film Temple Grandin, about the wonderful Temple Grandin, the great autistic activist. And then these last few things, thank you for hanging on a little late. You can go to the Implicit Bias Association test site. Harvard University is continuing to accept data from anyone who wants to take the implicit bias test in terms of race or gender or different categories. They run different tests at different times. I've been a gender activist most of my life, and I failed the implicit bias test on gender. I was shocked. Take it. It's a fabulous thing to get to understand how these categories of privilege get embedded in us so deeply that we're not conscious of them. And then, of course, the obvious. Lots of TED Talks out there. Pick out some of these writers and speakers that are mentioned in the resources and look up their names for TED Talks and for YouTube Talks, and just immerse yourself in any of these particular creative people that are mentioned in the resources. And last but definitely not least, a few podcasts. My all-time favorite forever, The Memory Palace. These are short, 10 minutes roughly on average, and many of them talk about exquisite, tiny little stories of a 12-year-old girl who's winning the spelling bee in her area as the first African-American student to do so. Little stories about real people that can elevate you or break your heart, or both at the same time. the beautiful anonymous episode is one of the few I've seen, heard from that podcast. The Kitchen Sisters do always great work, but my favorite of all podcasts right now is called Seeing White. And if you don't want to listen to all of it, you just want one episode, go to number 13. It's called White Affirmative Action, and it gives the history of white economic privilege that's been granted throughout before American history. It starts in Europe with indentured servants who came to this country, and the whites were given different goods when they were done with their servitude than people of color were. So this is 400 years plus of white affirmative action done in episode 13, but the whole Seeing White series is spectacular. So I've gone on too long. Thank you for listening, but this just gives you a place to begin looking at unpacking and getting excited about this extraordinary garden of cultural differences that we are blessed to live within. Thank you so much, everybody.